So, what did we do last night? Yesterday's stuff was the rest stuff, right? So, how'd all that go? I heard through the grapevine there were a few questions, things that I could cover a bit more today. Generally well, generally not well.
Yeah, I mean, it works, so good enough.
Any questions about how all that was put together?
I did spend some quality time with the documentation, so that helped a little bit.
Right. Uh, yeah, let's. There must have been some other questions out there. Go ahead and throw them up in chat. What is the hyperlinked model and why did we use it? That's a good question. So, I don't think I've gotten as far as putting that into my code, but let's see the notes here. We've got the serializer, and there we go. So we had something like this, right? The hyperlinked model serializer. So what is all this stuff doing in here? This block of code. So in general, a serializer is a thing that takes, yeah, what is serialization? In general, serialization, try not to be too general. In the most general sense, it's transforming one piece of data or transforming data from one format to another. But typically, the format with serialization that is the data is transformed into is something that is human or machine readable. And so it's usually taking some data that's represented in memory someplace and turning it into something that is human or machine readable that can be transmitted over a network or saved on a disk. So you've got some stuff in memory, like some variables or some objects or something, and you want to take that information and you want to transmit it over the network to somebody, you're going to serialize that. So you're going to take it from its whatever in-memory representation we have in our JavaScript code, and then they get transformed into some other format, for example, JSON, for instance, and then transmitted over the network. Does that make sense from a serialization standpoint? We want to take something that we have in our code, something that we have in memory, and transform it into a data format that can be either saved to disk or transmitted across a network. And so that's what this personal note serializer is doing. We've got personal note model, and we've got some fields within that, and we've got to take that model, like we have some personal note object out there in memory, and we've got to take that personal note object and we've got to transform it into something that can be viewed by humans or transmitted over a network. Uh, so what is the hyperlink model serializer? And I'm a little bit upset that I don't have this coded in here already. Actually, could I? Hang on a second. Let me pop back to an earlier class. Because I think in here, I think this one I have all set up. This is the equivalent of me reaching under the table during the cooking show and pulling out the already completed turkey. Let's see here. Come on. That was weird. I just searched for capital or for letter A. One second, I got no notes back because I don't think I'm logged in. All right, let's see some notes. Great. Actually, more importantly, let's just see API. All right. So yes, what does the hyperlink serializer get us? This is where I was getting to because I wanted to demonstrate it. So the hyperlinked serializer is smart enough to know when you view your API through a web page, like I'm doing right now, right? I'm not using Axios to hit it. I've just gone to it with a web browser. And because I've done that, Django's like, oh, hey, instead of just handing you some JSON data, how about I hand you all this crazy stuff that describes things for you? So if we were just using Axios, we wouldn't see this web page, right? We'd see a JSON response that had this information in it right here. But because we're hitting it with a browser, we're getting all this information. And if you notice, what we have here is some serialized data. Like somewhere inside our database, sure, we know that we have a notes endpoint, and we know that it goes here, and that's in memory somewhere on this computer. But if we want to show that to a person, we have to serialize it. We serialize it into JSON. But you might also notice that if I mouse over this thing, it's a hyperlink. So what we've got here is some serialized data, and it's hyperlinked to stuff. And I believe the same would be true in here if we had something else that it's linked to. But we don't. That's a great question. And I'm not aware of them, but it's because I'm ignorant of it. Are there any other notable serializers? I'm sure there are. We can probably dig here and see if we can find some serializer docs. Serializers for the Django REST framework. Uh, let's see. This is kind of low-level stuff, it looks like. I saw this for the JSON serializer or JSON renderer. So it takes our serializer data and it renders it as JSON. Got model serializer, hyperlinked model serializer, list serializer, base serializer. So I'll post this link. Would a picture be possible with the client serializer and database? Sorry, what do you mean? Would a picture be possible? Like a diagram? I'll have to have something to draw with. I could probably come up with something, and I'm going to preface it with the caveat that a little bit of it is guesswork because I don't actually know how the guts of Django are implemented. So let me do it more generally, and so I won't even pretend that I know how that's working. Let's see here. It's been a long time since I've drawn anything here, so bear with me. Okay, so the idea, if we have a client here, and then we have the internet here, and some data gets transmitted back and forth this way across the internet. And it's a lovely diagram. And then on the server side, I'm just going to draw a big box here for the server side. But we have on the server side a database. And then somehow, let's see, we got to get this stuff out over the internet. And that's where our serializer is going to come into play. So data gets transmitted from the server over the internet to the client. It's stored in the database in some way. And then in here, we're going to have a chunk of code. Oops, I'm not going to have enough room for that. So data is going to come out of the database. It's going to go into the serializer, and that's going to get sent out over the network like that. And again, this isn't so much a Django diagram as a general diagram. So we've got some data that's represented in some internal form in the database, and then we need that to be changed into some other format. And that other format could be a lot of things, but I don't know, we could just say it's a JSON, etc. in there. That is a heck of a flowchart. That's a great diagram for internals. Yeah, was that, I don't know if that was helpful or not. It's like somehow we've got to get that data out of the database and into a form that we can deal with. JSON you guys are used to, but the serializer could actually put it into all kinds of different forms. It could just be a list of key value pairs, or it could be some binary format that's not human readable, but is transmittable. Let's see, can I talk a bit about managers? Oh, you're gonna crush me with this one. I'm gonna delete this drawing if anybody wants it. Grab it now. I guess it's in the video. All right, let's get rid of that thing. Get me out of annotate mode. All right, let's learn more about managers, because honestly, that's not something I've used a lot. So, computer, there we go. I'm logged into Chrome as multiple users, so it doesn't always let me stack my windows together the way I want. All right, what do we got here? Let's see if we can figure this one out. I wouldn't say it's not that important because it's there. It's just a piece of this. So on this diagram, my exposure to Django is limited to a few areas on this diagram. And so it's clearly the manager part is important because it's resting right here between the model and the database. So the model is kind of where my exposure starts. And I know there's a database down there somewhere, but as a Django user, I don't really need to know that much about it. So the manager is doing something in the middle here. And probably doing some. So anytime you see a diagram like this one, blow this up a little. So we got models on the one hand, we got database on the other hand. Sitting in the middle is the manager. Middle managers, huh? And so clearly the manager knows how to talk to models and the manager knows how to talk to databases. So the immediate implication is that this is some piece of software that is acting kind of like as a translator somehow. And the database, we know that the database has a well-known API for accessing it, like it's a SQL database, so we need to issue SQL commands. So the manager, I suspect, is very adept at figuring that stuff out, and is probably good at reading models and figuring out how to map those models to the databases. But what do we have here? A manager is the interface through which database query operations are provided to Django models. All right. It's one of those sentences I read and I'm like, yeah, okay. Maybe tell me a little more about that. The way manager classes works is documented making queries. This document touches on model options that customize manager behavior. So I don't really feel like customizing. I just want to know how it works. To retrieve objects from your database, construct a query set via a manager on your model class. Let's see. Okay, this is still not giving me a happy answer, but this one helps a little bit. The manager is the main source of query sets on a model. So when you execute something like this, .objects.all, like personal note.objects.all, you get a query set back. I don't know if anybody noticed that or used that in the Python shell. Let's see here. Is it notes models? No. From notes import. No, notes not models. Am I doing this right? Okay. I always forget what is plural and what is not. So if I run this ORM query right here to get all the personal notes back, I end up with a query set object. And because I've got the query set object back, it says here that the manager is the main source of query sets. So I've interfaced with the manager somehow or another. It says managers are accessible only via model classes rather than from model instances to enforce a separation between table level operations and record level operations. So what this is saying is that when we do something like .objects.all or .objects.filter, we're doing that on a table, in a table level sense. We're looking at the entire table as opposed to some individual record in there. And so the managers are accessible on the classes, just like we saw here. I ran this on the personal note class. So it's I'm kind of building this idea in my head of what the manager is. I'm like, okay, so somehow by executing this ORM query, I've talked to the manager. and the manager went out to the database, it got that data, it turned it into a query set for me, and it gave me that query set back. Which is kind of what we were thinking, right? The manager's like the go-between. It talks to the database on the one side and then talks back to us on the model side. So it's acting kind of as a translator. Presumably, it can also go the other way. Then I can not just make query requests, but probably do other things through the manager. Let's see, if I click on this, does that give me something better? No, same document we were at before. Ooh, check that out. I like this. So this is something I've never had to do. But you can subclass manager, apparently, and make your own manager. And then within that, you can actually throw some SQL in there. That's pretty cool. Super customizable. So connects I'm not that familiar with. In fact, I don't know at all. So definitely maybe. Does it sound similar based on what I've said? The problem with working in technology is that there's so much of it. It's also the beautiful thing about working in technology. Okay, cool. That sounds similar to me. I don't think it is a manager. I think it has one, though. I think it has a manager buried in it somewhere. I wonder if we could find it. Well, it's not obvious. Kind of digging around in internals now. Ha! There we go. So I just asked for help on personal note.objects. That is the manager, because it gave me manager help when I pulled it up. And now we can see some of the stuff we have at our disposal. Aggregate, annotate, bulk create. Oh, these are inherited from base manager query set. Oh. So it inherits from all these things. Get, none. Like theoretically all should be in here somewhere, right? Earlier, you saw a DB manager in there too? Oh, DB manager right there. Wonder what that is. Something internal, because it's not well documented. Yeah, not much to it. But at least we know personal note.objects is the manager now. Oh, there it is. I was like, what if it's not in here anywhere? Woo! Yes, dir and help are both pretty awesome. I was thinking about this the other day. I'm like, when is it good to use dir and help, and when is it good to just go read the documentation? And I didn't have a clear answer for myself. It's like now we're tearing into this stuff. And it's kind of fun to see like, oh, hey, what's going on down here? What are all these things? Like I've got at my disposal filter and bulk create and model. Like it's all kind of tied together down there, and it's difficult to tell what is. Or like when we got asked for help on DB manager and we got nothing. Like at that point, I feel like we're looking at stuff that we're not supposed to be looking at because it's not documented. So maybe it's too low level to be useful. But then when you do help a person load objects and it's like, oh, hey, this is a class manager and you got pages and pages and pages of stuff, then okay, that's something. So with dir, I don't know a way. The closest thing Vim I've got for you with help is that when you're paging through here, there is a regex finder. If you hit slash, like regular /, then you can type something to look for, and it'll go find those. And that's a regular expression as well. And then if you hit N, it will find the next one, if there is one. In fact, when we're looking at help here, if you're good with VI, VI commands work within this help thing. So like I can use J and K to move, I can say 20G to go to the 20th line, and so on. And I can search for any words that start with CO, that kind of thing. Yeah, and N, it goes to the next match, and capital N goes to the previous match, just like VI. Quick poll. I'm kind of curious about this. I do recommend learning VI because it's everywhere, and sometimes if you SSH into a server and need to edit a file, you can just use VI to do it, where some GUI might not work. Plus, so many places use VI key bindings like this. Also, I maintain, your mileage may vary, I maintain that once you get good at VI, you are actually faster at editing than you are at a standard editor. The learning curve is steep, but there's a payoff of being able to do more stuff more quickly. Vim is VI, true, yes. Vim stands for VI improved. Visual Studio Code has a great NeoVim plugin if you want to use Vim inside Visual Studio Code. And yes, Vim Adventures is a fun. I'm sorry, I'm digressing on VI here. It just made me think of it because I'm like, oh, the help pager uses VI commands. There you go. A while back, I made this list of commonly used VI commands, and I thought I'd have like 4 or 5 things in there. But it turns out I use a lot of VI commands very frequently. So I should do some demo sometime. Anyhow, enough VI stuff. What were we talking about? Managers. Did we wrap that up? Did we get through all that managery stuff? That was a good little rabbit hole to dive down. Thanks for that. Because I'd never looked there before. I mean, I knew that there was clearly some piece of software that was doing some translation between me saying, hey, give me all the things, and actual SQL. So I knew there was something there. I just didn't know what and where it was. So this builds my web of knowledge about Django a little bit more. And I'm sure you guys are seeing, going through the documentation and just looking at that diagram, that wonderful, wonderful block diagram, that there are a lot of parts here. And we've gotten pretty far just by learning a couple of these things, which is nice. But all these things are here for a reason. That's functionality that we can use as we learn it. Oh. Any other questions? Or did anything out of the pre-course stuff or the stuff you did yesterday, did it strike you as interesting, or was there any bit that caught your eye? Oh, oh, is there an efficient way to navigate a file system? Uh, Maybe. Let me see. Is this what you're getting at? If you run Vim on a directory, it brings up a directory browser that you can use to move around and open files. But I don't know if that's is that kind of what you're asking? Read only. I'm trying to remember all my commands here. Ugh. Let's see here. So O opens a file in a new window. So like cookie.txt, open a new window. But there's some way to open with like a split, like a vertical split. I don't remember what it is. N? No. Yeah, I can't remember all my commands on this. It's not capital O. That did weird things. Oh yeah. So if you hit T, it opens it in a new tab, which is a little bit better. So then you have a tab that has your directory open, and then I can open these in new tabs. Yeah. Pretty cool. Let's see. Can you change? Let's see. With Vim, do you almost never need to use the mouse. Yes, you almost never need to use the mouse. You can, but you can also, it also has like visual block mode, so I can just be like, hey, I want to select these lines. The only weird thing is if you're using command line Vim and I want to select these lines and copy them into the system clipboard so that I can paste them into Chrome or something, that gets to be problematic. In that case, I'm like, okay, well, then I do have to use the mouse and hit Command C to copy that data out of the terminal. But if you're using mvim, which is, or if you're using some Vim GUI thing, then your copy to the buffer or copy to the clipboard should work totally fine. Whoops, that was a directory. Let's open this in a new tab. Yeah, so here I should be able to like do a visual selection, not using my mouse at all, and then copy that to the system clipboard. Huh. I wonder if there might actually be a way to do that from command line Vim too. You can also do, you can select from a cursor point to another cursor point. You can also do block selects like this. All kinds of good stuff. So without using the mouse, you get a lot of stuff done. And then there are also commands for copying, like if I want to copy 3 rows of text into a buffer, I can do that. And then I can paste them down here, also without using the mouse. And if you want to delete chunks of code, there are commands for like delete to the end of the line, or delete up through the equal, up to the equal sign. So there's all kinds of stuff you can do without selecting anything with the mouse, which is cool. I should do a Vim brown bag, eh? Would that be good? And after a while, you get used to using H, J, K, and L to move the cursor as well. And so you don't even have to take your hands off the keyboard over to the arrow keys. You just stay right there. Let's see. And Mark asked, can you change the key binding for the directions? I think you can change the key bindings for anything, but I would encourage you to just get used to the key bindings for moving. And after a while, it becomes second nature to use J and K to move up and down. I can't help you with Emacs. There's the old joke of like what do Emacs users need to know about VI, and there's like the VI cheat sheet for Emacs users, and it goes something like this. And of course, there is a similar cheat sheet, Emacs for VI users. I can't remember how to exit Emacs. It's like meta X something. I don't know. All right, we've successfully derailed, I think. Let's see. Query sets. What else do I have on my list to talk about? Let me see here. Uh-oh. The README and the wiki say different things. Wait, the Lambda README and the core's wiki? The Lambda README is probably wrong. All right, I'll have a look at the wiki and see. It could be that the information in the README is just wrong or it's outdated. But yeah, when in doubt, go with the wiki, because they're the authoritative source of information. Oh yeah, it's a little bit vague there. Yeah, the README is like after installation. I think the implication of the README is that installation includes this stuff. So yeah, that could totally be clearer. Is everybody up on what cores actually does? Like what that's for? Is that something you guys have talked about? I can give you the 30,000 foot view that I have of it, and hopefully I'm remembering everything right. Don't give you guys misinformation. If you know better and I say something wrong, please correct me. Yeah, request from a different origin. Yeah, CORE stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. And there are certain restrictions. Let me start with the backstory on how this works. There are certain restrictions on requests that you can make to other servers. And this has to do with, if I'm remembering right, it has to do with cross-site scripting attacks. We don't want certain scripts running on certain sites to have willingly access to data on other sites. We want to restrict that access a little bit. So there's this thing with XHR, XML, HTTP requests, with AJAX requests, called the same origin policy. And what that means is that if you've loaded a web page from example.com, and then that web page runs some JavaScript that executes an AJAX request to get more data, like or use Axios or something to get more data, that Axios request can only go to example.com. This is the same origin policy. So by default, this is the way things work. If I've loaded a web page from example.com, that web page tries to run an Axios request to a REST endpoint. Axios is only allowed to go to example.com, to an endpoint on example.com. It's restricted to that. It can't go out to yahoo.com and make a REST request from there. So that is the default, the same origin policy. So you might be wondering at this point, you're like, how do we make a REST API request to anywhere then? Because clearly I'm running my app on example.com and I make REST calls to GitHub, I make REST calls to wherever. How are those allowed? Because github.com is clearly a different domain. It's a different, it's a different domain, different than the origin, which was example.com. So how is that allowed? And the answer is CORS. So I think, let me know if that's unclear. The takeaway is that by default, API calls can only be made to the same server that you got the main web page from. But CORS allows a relaxation of that rule. The restriction can be removed. And typically when you have a public API, like GitHub's API, they remove the restriction for all sites. So all sites are allowed to go to github.com and make API requests there. But CORS can actually be a little more restrictive. You could set up a server that says, I will allow connections only from these other origins, and you list some other domains. You're like, I'll allow connections from these 3 domains, but in general not. You can set it up to be more restrictive. So what we're doing here when we say CORS origin allow all equals true, this is saying, hey, any other domains can connect to this REST server that we've built and get information from it. I'm a little bit reluctant to talk about the attack that same origin policy is meant to prevent because it's fuzzy in my brain right now. I'd have to go research it again. But does that make sense? So by default, you can only connect back to the server your web page came from, but CORS allows a relaxation of that. Other servers can declare themselves to be accessible. I should point out that CORS is purely a JavaScript XHR thing, like purely a JavaScript AJAX thing. CORS doesn't actually disallow like command line. You could use curl, you could use postman, you could use these things to connect and get information back from a REST endpoint. In fact, if you write server-side code in Python or whatever, that server-side code can always go out to that REST endpoint. All that server-side stuff ignores CORS. It doesn't have same origin policy. It's a JavaScript thing that has same origin policy. And that is there because JavaScript is subject to these cross-site scripting attacks that same origin policy is meant to prevent. So yeah, there are cool topics on deck, but we could totally talk about how the create override is happening. Yes. But before we do that, it's been about an hour, so why don't we take 5 and go reload our coffee and tea. I kind of wanted to tear into that bit of code anyway, like with the serializer, and kind of talk about how that works. Let's see, where is it? Okay. All right, let's do 5. Let me bring this up. My low-tech timer. All right. See all you guys shortly. Howdy, everybody. Ignore the barking of the space dog if you hear that in the background. Probably squirrels outside, space squirrels. All right. Let's see here. Maybe talk about the create method. Let's have a look and see what we got in here. This poor computer is gonna croak. I probably have like a bazillion Visual Studio Code tabs open here. All right, so what are we looking at? API. All right, so we're thinking about this create thing. Whoa, too much. Right, I'm running around in the right place here. Bim, right? All right. Well, let's see here. Let's kind of talk about a slightly bigger overview of this and kind of how I think about what these two things are doing. So the serializer, we've kind of already talked about how it's transforming the data, but it needs to know which model it's using to transform the data. It also needs to know which fields it needs to extract out of that model to give back. So this is setting up information that the serializer needs to know in order to produce records. The view set down here is related to the serializer. It has a reference to it. But what it's doing is deciding which records out of the database to give back. So the serializer here is kind of talking about what information per record, and the view set down here is talking about which records. So in my mind, this is kind of how these two pieces relate. And it's two pieces of information we need to know. We need to know which records, we need to know what things out of each record. But what about this create thing? So what this is doing is there's a create method already probably on a model serializer somewhere deep down, and that create method probably does some default action. I'm not entirely sure because that's getting into internals. But what we can do is we can specify our own create, and what this will do is when we make a new note, or a new personal note in this case, it allows us to customize how that thing is created. So by default, when a personal note is made, some code that looks, let me comment all this out, and I'll take these lines there. Some code that looks like this would probably run. If anybody put did anybody put a debugger break in here? Let's do this and run it and see what happens. So I'll set this breakpoint in the debugger, and then we'll see what gets hit at this point. And this is in the create code. For this, let's see, personal note list, API, notes, hit reload, make sure everything's still happy. All right. So I'll post that, and we're going to hit our breakpoint here. So it's sitting there waiting for localhost because we've hit our breakpoint. You see, we're about to execute that line of code, and I want to see what validated data is. Validated data. And so our validated data is this object, or dictionary, rather. I keep calling it object because JavaScript terminology dies hard. We've got this dictionary with title and content, and the title is Fred's notes, and the content is test, which is, of course, the stuff I've just typed in right here, right? So we see that information is in validated data, and we can make new notes. Do I have access to this? Yeah, all right. So you can always make a new note. Doing something like this. Actually, this isn't going to work because it's a personal note, but if I'm making a new regular note, and I need title equals hi, and content equals foo, why did that fail? That caught me off guard. Well, it's saying my user ID is missing, but I didn't think I had a user ID in my note. So oh, I know what's happened. I'm dumb. The Python debugger can only do so much stuff. And here I'm trying to do something kind of complicated. It was happy to tell me what a personal note was, but here I'm trying to run a Python expression, and the Python debugger, how does it throw me for a total loop? The Python debugger looks at the first character and figures out that this is a debugger command, which is N, which means run the next line of code. So when I typed in all this stuff, it didn't actually create a note. It didn't do anything that I thought at all. All it did was use the debugger command and N, which means run the next thing. And so it tried to run this line right here. And then it gave me this error, which I expected. Okay, that makes a little more sense. What I was going to do is create a new note here. My point was to show you that you could use keyword arguments like title and content to create a new note, which is something you're probably familiar with. But this is kind of weird, right? Actually, let me continue this and let me try one more time to make this happen. Post. All right, we're back in the debugger, back to where we were. Yeah, I kind of wonder what's going to happen if I do that. I have to type this again. Yeah, you're right. It totally works. That's so strange. Learn something about the debugger here. But yeah, what we've got here is this validated data thing, and this double asterisk is kind of a more rarely used Python thing. So as a quick refresher, validated data is this dictionary, and it's got title and content, which are the keyword argument names that we need to create a new note. And so by putting the double asterisk in front of a dictionary, that's telling Python, hey, take that dictionary and pretend I just typed those in as keyword arguments. So call create just as if I typed title equals Fred's note, content equals test. And this is kind of the default action for what create does. It's we want to make a new note, so go ahead and make a new note and return it. So that's sort of the default behavior for our create method. But of course, we run into trouble here because we're trying to create a personal note, and the personal note requires a user ID or a user to be created as well. So if I run this line of code with N, it pukes saying like, hey, not null constraint failed. You didn't specify user ID. I'll hit C to continue. Everything explodes, and so on. So we need to get a user ID in there somehow. One option would be to have like a little pull-down menu that says, hey, I want to put a new note in for admin or put a new note in for Fred. But that's kind of a weird thing to do because we don't want Fred to be able to put in a new note for admin or vice versa, potentially. So why don't we try to extract the user automatically based on who's logged in? So that's what this code is doing here. Let's go figure out who's logged in based on the request. And then this line's kind of interesting. I like it. So the double asterisk, we take the validated data dictionary and we treat it as keyword arguments. So like title equals, content equals. But then we can add another keyword argument before that if we want. You just throw another one in there. User equals. So in a way, this is sort of like adding on to the validated data, adding one more field in there, which is exactly what we had to do to get a personal note created because it was missing that one field. So we create the new note, we give it an additional field, and then we return it. And so in our create method here, we're overriding that default behavior we saw before. So the default behavior was just to create a personal note with whatever validated data came in. And we're like, in this case, that's not enough. We need to add the user field. So we're going to override create so that we can get that user field in there. Was that on track for answering the question? Or am I still off to the side somewhere?
Yeah. No, B just wanted to ask on line 13, how are you able to change the definition of create objects.create and to accept a new input like user if you couldn't do that?
Let me rephrase that and make sure I'm understanding the question. Because we've got this clearly create as a method that is on that .objects attribute, which we saw was a manager earlier. How are we able to just throw in new arbitrary arguments?
Right.
Yeah. So this is a good question. And I don't know, maybe I can crowdsource this slightly to you guys. If anybody, can somebody dig through the Django source and try to find the source for the create method on the manager? If somebody wants to do that, that would probably be kind of awesome to see. So in the manager class in Django, there's going to be a create method. There's going to be source code for that. But without seeing that, I'll describe it this way. What the create method does deep down is it actually looks to see what all the keyword arguments are. And then it goes through those keyword arguments one at a time and uses that information to do the work that it needs to do. So if I could write some code here, what's going to be the best way to do this? I think print will work for me. All right, so I've defined that little function that takes some keyword args and prints them. Shows KW args. So if I run this function, and I've just passed it in some arbitrary things, right? I just made that up, foobar and baz. And then this function prints those out. And the keyword arguments, if you've got the two asterisks here in the function definition, this gets exposed as a dictionary. And so we see this dictionary right here with all my keys and values that I've specified on the command line. So at runtime, we could write a function that would take arbitrary arguments with names that could be anything, right? And values that could be anything. And so that gives us a whole lot of flexibility in a way. Like here, I haven't changed this function at all, and yet I've called it with all kinds of different arguments, and it's perfectly happy. And so if we write some more specialty code in here, other than just printing it out, we could loop through the keys in the dictionary, and we could do different behaviors based on what the values of the keys were. We have all kinds of flexibility there. And in fact, if I do want to have time to do this, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, looking at the ORM stuff, there are ways to specify crazy keywords for filtering. You can do something like note.objects.filter, objects.filter, and something like this. If I'm kind of sure this is what it is. So this is a weird thing, right? Surely the filter code doesn't know about title, because that's not something that occurs in every single model. Models could have arbitrarily named fields within them. But inside the filter code, it's going to go look at all the keyword arguments, just like the show keyword arguments function here looked at them. It's going to go look through it, and it'll do something like, oh, hey, I see I have a keyword argument that has a double underscore in it and ends with the word starts with. So the code for filter will parse this out, and then it'll say, okay, well, what do I need to check that to see that it starts with? And it'll go look at the first part of the key, title, and be like, okay, the title field. I need to run code that checks to see if the title field starts with this string that got passed in. So it gives you all kinds of power using these keyword arguments. Not only can you specify arbitrary keys and values to go into a function without changing that function, but the function itself could look at the keys and values and alter its behavior based on what the keys are. Pretty crazy. Let's have a look here. Was this something in manager? This looks promising. And pull this out and drag it onto the screen here. Base manager, auto-created, create method. Okay, this is more complicated than I think I want to look into. It's got some kind of factory here that's doing something that's not going to be easy to look at. Anyway. I wonder if I can come up with a good example of a function that did different behavior. How do you check if something is in a dictionary? Can you use in? I can't remember. There's contains, but that's for in, right? See if I can come up with a better piece of demo code other than simply printing out what the dictionary is. Oh, all right. Let's see. Did we finish that? Key and self-storage. Node equals self-storage key. Oh yeah, there you go. So you could use that to test to see if the keyword arguments contain a certain key or value. A little aside, you see me there forgetting how to check to see if a key is in a dictionary in Python. Something that I know is possible, but then I get confused with the different languages I have in my brain and have to look it up. Totally normal. Anything else on this topic? Did we cover it? I heard through the grapevine there was a question about model view controller, and Django clearly has views. Is that the same as the view and the MVC? And the answer is no. Django has kind of done their own thing. I'm just going to post a link to the FAQ on that one right here. So yes, Django is MVC-ish. They just don't use the same words. So and they have a rationale for it. Just the way they decided to do things. What else we got? I can throw in some more GraphQL stuff. Or anything. What's on your all's minds? The sprint. The sprint is just going to be the usual create a Facebook clone from scratch. So should be good. No, the sprint is a little bit different. Just like the sprint challenge is a little bit different. Just like the sprint is a little bit different. The sprint challenge is going to be to deploy to Heroku. And there's not, the main thing that happens in the sprint is some kind of configuration pain. And some people sail through it and everything just deploys and everyone's happy. And other times there's some crazy corner case configuration issue that causes problems. There are sort of two takeaways from the sprint challenge, and one of them is dealing with the weird stuff that happens the first time you go to make a deploy, because you have to set up everything the first time. You set up this gigantic framework of stuff. And then the second takeaway is that subsequent deploys, once it's set up, are trivial. So this big pile of setup, and then to deploy after that, you just push and things work, which is great. Well, let's see. What does it mean when they say a battery's included? Web application framework. I don't like that term very much, and I'm not even sure what their. I think the implication there is that it's more ready to go, and you don't really have to do much to get it going. But I don't think there's a standard industry definition for what that actually means. But yeah, lots of stuff to use, and you don't have to install other things to make it happen. And configuration is probably minimal. What would be the opposite of a batteries included framework? It'd probably be some sort of like minimalist something. Yeah, C doesn't include any batteries, that's for sure. Some assembly required. Isn't it weird how expressions like that get permanently imprinted on your brain from like all the cartoons you watched as a kid? Your parents have to put it together. Decreased or eliminated external libraries. Yeah. When it would be like overkill to use an ORM framework? I'm having trouble thinking when it would ever be overkill. ORM frameworks are there to make your life easier. So typically it's a desirable thing, as opposed to just like writing SQL code, you mean? Solar powered framework. You should do that. If you invent a framework, you should say that it's solar powered. And then people can wonder what the heck that means. I guess technically, basically all the energy we use for all our programming comes from the sun. All right, we can do some GraphQL setup. Let's see if I have that set up in this thing already or not. I do. Blast. Okay. I wonder if this is getting into the gray area of what does it take to qualify as an ORM. I don't know. I think to answer the question, I'm going to have to look at connects a little more to see what it does. Because the ORM is this term. It's the object relational mapper, right? We've got some relational database. We've got a mapping between that and some objects, and the ORM sits there and does that mapping. So then we got ORM frameworks versus query builders, and it's getting a little vague in my mind where the line is drawn. So it builds the query. Does it not run the query? Somebody else runs the query? Yeah, I'm just simply not familiar with it, so I'm going to have to look and see where it fits into the entire structure. Well, let's see. We got 15 minutes left. Let's see if we can do some setup for GraphQL. And I think I have, let's see here. Let me get rid of this altogether. Oops, what do I call that? There we go. I'm going to also make sure that this is running. Remember where we left this, if it was someplace that was happy or not. Seems like it. Okay. So let's see about adding some GraphQL stuff to this. So we saw yesterday that there's that GraphQL front end, and we can actually add that front end to our stuff. And then mess around with that and get information out. And it's going to be very similar to what we did with the REST endpoint, which I don't actually have defined in this version of the app, but I think will be okay. So I have a README I can share with you guys for this too. But the basic idea is that we're going to use a library called Graphene, and Graphene is going to help us write a GraphQL endpoint and run that from our server. So just like we did in the pre-course stuff for today, setting up a REST endpoint using the Django REST framework, we're going to use Graphene to set up a GraphQL endpoint. And it's going to work in a very similar way. So I'm going to install this stuff. And again, this is in a README I'll share with you guys. Whoa, I'm going to put my hands in the right places on the keyboard and have that work correctly. So I'm going to install this library, Graphene Django, and then we're going to make a few changes. We need to enable this installed app once it gets put into place. We're going to enable that in our settings, just like we enabled notes in our installed apps. We're going to enable Graphene Django. So we'll add that to our installed apps. And then what we need to do is something similar to what we did with REST. So in REST, we said, hey, this is the model. These are the fields that we want to expose. And then we're also going to say which records we want to show, just like we did with the REST stuff. I'm going to make a new file for this. Under notes, I'm going to make something called schema.python. And then we're going to slowly connect our model, our personal note model. We're going to connect that up with an endpoint, the GraphQL endpoint. So on the one hand, we'll be able to go to this GraphQL endpoint and make GraphQL queries. And on the other end of that is our personal note model. And we have to write some code in the middle that connects our personal note model up to that endpoint so that we can get our data out. And some of this is boilerplate. So from Graphene, Django, we're going to bring in Django object type. And I'm also going to just, man. Everything's going backwards. All right. We're also going to bring in graphene so we can use things out of there. And then I'm going to bring in my personal note model. Because the personal note model is what we want to connect up. So again, we're going to first describe which fields we're interested in, out of which model, and we're going to then describe which rows, which records to return. But this is GraphQL. With REST, we were specifying, hey, I want to return title and content. But GraphQL, we can write a query on the client side and get anything returned. So we're not going to actually specify which fields. We're going to let the client specify which fields when they make a GraphQL request. So I'm going to declare this personal note. I'm going to make a new class called personal note type, and that is inheriting from Django object type that we just pulled in there at the top in our imports. And this is where we're going to connect to our personal note model. And we're going to use an inner class, again called meta, just like we did with REST. And we're going to connect it to our model. So we brought this in. We've got our personal note type. It's connected to our personal note model. The other thing we have to describe here is what type of data. Meta is the name that it expects, so it has to be called meta in this case. It's not really a standard name, but when Graphene is building up its endpoint and its functionality, it's going to be looking for an inner class named meta here. The other thing we have to tell it is what kind of data this is. You remember that there are edges in the graph and there are nodes in the graph. We're going to tell it explicitly that this is a node. And this is a tuple here. So I have to put a trailing comma at the end to declare that it's a tuple with a single item in it. So we've said, okay, this is a node. Each of these things that we show is going to be a node is connected to the personal note model. And now we need to decide which rows to return. And remember I said that there are queries and mutations. We're going to define a class to handle queries right now. And this inherits from graphene.object type. And that's, again, something that I'm not quite sure what we're pulling in, why we have to declare from object type. So this is something I'm like, oh, it's boilerplatey. I can figure it out later. So we're also going to kind of define which fields we want to give back at this point. And so we can do it like this. Graphene.list, we're going to give a list of notes back. And we're going to connect that up to our personal note type here. So you can kind of see how the data is flowing a little bit. We've got a personal note model, and we have that here. So the personal note type class is aware of our model. It has that connection. And then we're writing a query that has a connection right here to our personal note type. So in your mind, you can kind of visualize how this data is being connected or the data is flowing. It's a good skill to have, to be able to see how data is moving around within a system. And then we want to can't tell what emoji that is. Oh, matrix. All right, so yeah. What do we want to do next? We want to figure out which records we want to return out of this. We know that we're going to return a list of records because we're saying the notes is that list. Change my, the README's got flaws. The README has flaws. So resolve notes. And this gets these two things. So when we do a query, this function is going to get called here when we do a query on notes in particular. And so we've got to figure out what we want to return. I'm just going to start with this. Let's see, personal note.objects.all. So we'll grab all the personal notes and just return them. You remember in REST, we did some kind of stuff where we're like, oh, hey, which user's logged in? Return the notes for just that user. We can do exactly the same thing here. I'll put that as a to-do. But right now, we'll just return all of them. And then one more piece of boilerplate code here. We have to declare a variable in here that refers to our entire GraphQL schema. And we're going to refer to this variable outside when we set up the endpoint. A-B-A-G-N-E, graphene. Oh, I can spell. And the schema can have a couple things in it. It can have queries, it can have mutations, it can have other things. We've only defined a query so far. So I'm going to refer to this query class that we defined. So the code is pretty boilerplatey. Like you have to type this, now you have to type that, now you have to type that. But there's really not much of it, which is kind of impressive. So we got a couple more things we have to do to make this work. We have to do some configuration in our settings.py file. And we have to add a GraphQL endpoint to our URLs. This last piece of configuration is what's going to connect this guy up to our endpoint. So in our notes schema file, we have a schema variable. Sure, I don't have anything in here already. So I'm going to add some graphing configuration to my settings.py, and I'm going to say where the schema is. And we said that was in the notes directory, in schema, oh, sorry, this needs to be a string. In the notes directory, in schema.py, in the schema variable. So this is us telling graphene, hey, you want to know where the schema is? It's referred to by this variable right here in the schema.py file in the notes directory. And again, thinking about our data, it's like, okay, now we've told graphene that the schema is in here in this variable. And if we go look at that variable, we see that we've got this graphene schema that refers to our query. And if we go look at our query, we see that we get some notes in a list that refer to the personal note type. And if we go look at our personal note type, we see that we have some metadata here that refers to our personal note. And if we go to our personal note, then there's the manager on there that we can use to get the actual data out of the database. So, at this point, we have a connection between our personal notes all the way through these layers up out to graphene, and graphene is now aware of it in the settings. So that's good, but what we really need to do is hook that up to an endpoint so that we can access it. And our endpoints go in our URLs section. Yeah, it's interesting to see where what refers to what, like all the way down, right? In complicated systems that are made up of multiple layers, the data transformations that occur are substantial. Uh, in fact, I don't know how much you guys talked about networking and like the 7-layer network model and stuff like that. Uh, but every single piece of data that goes out on the internet is wrapped up in multiple layers of headers, and tons of transformation like that happens as the packet gets wrapped up in like 5 layers of headers and then gets partially unwrapped on its route across the internet until it finally arrives at your computer and gets fully unwrapped and figures out which application needs to receive this data and stuff. It's pretty amazing. Anyway, let's throw this endpoint up because I've got 2 minutes left to do it, and then I'll share this README with you guys. So URL patterns here is kind of declaring which endpoints we have. I'm going to make a new one. I'm going to stop typing random things. I'm going to make a new one here called GraphQL, and we need to tell it what this is connected to. So what should happen basically when somebody hits that URL. And Graphene, fortunately, has all this code already written to hook that stuff up. So from Graphene Django, I'm going .views. I'm going to import GraphQL view, and then I'm going to use that to get the data out of our schema, out of our query. So GraphQL view as view. And then this little bit is really interesting. GraphQL equals true. If you remember from yesterday, GraphQL, oh man, so much lag. GraphQL is that really nice user interface we were using to query Star Wars planets. Yes, burrito. The 7-layer burrito model. I think that every time. It kills me. So by setting GraphQL to true, we're saying, oh, hey, Graphene, Django, we want to have that nice GraphQL user interface available to us. Pretty please, if we go hit the server. Did I save all my files? I did. Let's see how many syntax errors I have. Nothing. That's a little bit scary. Let's pop over to here and let's hit that GraphQL endpoint. GraphQL. Could not import note schema. Could not import name personal note. Boo. I was all ready to have great success and then go get burritos. But what have I done wrong here? Could not import name personal note. Is that from models? It's this line. Is that wrong? Am I in the right directory? Schema.py, models. Oh, I don't have personal note. My partial implementation is totally crushed here. Let's see here. Oh, I just did a substitution and typed in the wrong thing. All right. I don't have a personal note. I'm just changing it to note. So let's see if that makes things a little bit happier. Still unhappy. Yep, that's a typo. I'm having something in the back of my brain. I'm like, I've seen this before. It's not interface, it's interfaces. I gotta fix the README. And did you restart the server? I think so. Ha! 3 minutes over. So let's see, Documentation Explorer, just like we had before. Let's see what's in here. Query, we've got a notes query, and it returns a note type that's got this information in it. So notes query, let's go ahead and say go. And there we go. It's automatically said, oh, did you mean the ID? But yeah, maybe we wanted more. Let's get title and content as well. And there we go. Now we've got title and content. That ID is kind of ugly. Let's pull it out. Woo! I can't remember what that exclamation mark means. String! Date time! It has a meaning, I just don't remember what it is. All right. So I'll share that README. I'm going to fix up some of the stuff in the README that's not right. And I'll share that with you. But we managed to get this together with kind of a small amount of stuff. We imported graphene. We had to add this URL endpoint for GraphQL. We had to set up a little bit of stuff in our settings. We had to say what our schema was here. We also had to add graphene Django to our installed apps right here. And then we had to put this code in to hook all that stuff up. And the graphene library automagically put all that crazy stuff together for us. Now that said, Thomas, I totally agree. The devil's in the details. So the more complicated you want your endpoint to be, like the more complicated the queries you want, and so on, more code ends up being there. Like, for instance, returning notes for only the currently logged in user, which I'm unable to do in this repo because I haven't defined personal notes yet. That's going to require some more code. We're going to have to look in this, I think it's in self. Is it in self? It's either in self or info. No, it's in info. So in the info field, you can look up which current user is logged in. You can show just their notes, stuff like that. But of course, that requires more code here, calling filter instead of all, getting the user information, checking if the user is anonymous, and all that. So you can complexify this as much as you need to get the behavior you want out of it. Like one thing that we saw with the Tatooine demo yesterday was that you could do a particular query up here and you could just be like, hey, give me notes. Can I get focus or something? There we go. Give me notes that have like this specific ID in it. But we don't have support coded for that right now. So if I try to run that, it says unknown argument ID on field notes. So if we wanted to add arguments like this to look up a specific note by ID, we'd have to add some more code to make that happen. But not a ton of it. So, and it's kind of neat that you get to the basic level with a small amount of code like this. Anyhow, thanks for staying over 7 minutes. It is burrito time for sure. I'll clean up these notes and send them to you right away. And then I also have some stuff some pre-course stuff for tomorrow. I'll post those too. Any last-minute requests? Woohoo! Fun and enlightening. That pleases me to hear. Sometimes it's hard to keep the fun in topics like this. I think they're all pretty neat, though. And I've been having a ball this week because you guys are throwing me these left field questions that I have to go learn about. So it's been fantastic. Like, what is the manager thing? How does that fit? Like, it's always kind of been in the back of my brain as a thing to look up, but never really got the chance. Got the chance today. All righty, gang. Thank you so much for your time, as always. I'll get you more information here about GraphQL and about stuff for, I think for tomorrow we're doing token authentication. And I'm getting remote from Git. All right. All righty, everybody. Have a good lunch. Enjoy your burritos, and I'll talk to you soon.